Imagine the world's most feared hunter becoming the hunted. This is The Bible Teaches. Today, we reveal the epic saga of Paul, God's fugitive. From a narrow escape in a basket to surviving a rain of stones and a deadly shipwreck, his life was a cinematic thriller of faith. Don't miss the secret of his resilience. Stay to watch as we enter the dark dungeons of Rome. You must wait to see how his final breath defeated an empire. There is a moment in every man's life when the ground disappears and the sky becomes the only possible horizon. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being at the top of the world, armed with the justice of a millennial law, with the power of life and death in your hands, and in the blink of an eye, being reduced to nothing. This is not just a story about religion. It is a chronicle of the total destruction of the ego for the birth of an unbreakable resilience. Saul of Tarsus was no ordinary man. He was terror incarnate to those who followed the way. His footsteps echoed through the corridors of Jerusalem with the authority of one who serves God with blind fury. He breathed threats and murder. Every breath of his was a decree of persecution. He did not see people. He saw targets. He did not hear pleas. He heard only the sound of duty. But destiny has an ironic way of reversing roles. The road to Damascus was not just a dirt path. It was the stage for a cosmic confrontation. Under the midday sun, a light that defied physics itself tore through the firmament. It was not a light that illuminated. It was a light that dismantled. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" In that question, the silence that followed was louder than any thunder. Before we continue this journey through the shadows of persecution, observe how your own life can change in an instant. Saul fell to the ground. The persecutor, the Lion of Israel, was now crawling in the dust. His eyes, once full of fire and judgment, were now open, yet plunged into the deepest darkness. Saul's blindness was not a punishment. It was a necessary mercy. Often, to see the truth about who we are and our own mental health, we need to be deprived of the distractions of the outside world. For 3 days, Saul did not eat. He did not drink. He did not see the light. He was trapped in the labyrinth of his own mind, confronting every face he had helped to martyr. Think about the weight of that isolation. The anxiety of an uncertain future, mixed with the grief for an identity that had just died. Saul of Tarsus died on that road. What remained was a broken man, waiting for the same voice that struck him down to now lift him up. What he did not know was that, from that moment on, he would never cease to be hunted. The hunt had now changed direction. He, who once led the caravans of imprisonment, would soon be fleeing over walls under the light of the moon. He was about to discover that following the truth requires a price that few are willing to pay. The world he loved would now hate him. The friends who respected him would now prepare the stones. The journey of God's fugitive had only just begun, and the first lesson of resilience would be learned at the lowest point a human being can reach. But that was not the end. And then, something even more serious happened. Imagine the silence of a city waiting for the right moment to kill. Damascus, one of the oldest cities in the world, was no longer a refuge of authority for Saul, but a stone trap. The gates were guarded day and night. The man who had arrived with letters of authorization to arrest was now the man whose death warrants were being signed. It was not legend. It was not imagination. It was not exaggeration. The conspiracy to eliminate Saul was real, cold, and meticulous. His former allies, those who shared bread and zeal for the law, now whispered in the alleys about how to extinguish the flame of that heresy before it spread. Think about that for a moment. How would you feel if the people who admired you most became the ones who most desired your destruction? A man's emotional health is tested in the isolation of betrayal. Saul was cornered. He could not leave through the main gates, for King Aretas's guards watched every shadow, every face, every movement. He was trapped between the promise of a new life and the imminent threat of a violent death. This was where everything changed. The escape did not come via a chariot of fire or an army of visible angels. It came through a wicker basket and the trembling hands of anonymous friends. Imagine the scene: the great intellectual, the Pharisee of Pharisees, the man trained at the feet of Gamaliel, being forced to shrink, to become small, to hide in a cargo basket. The descent down the wall of Damascus, under the mantle of darkness, was not just a physical descent, it was the final descent of his pride. With every inch the basket lowered down the rampart, a layer of the old Saul was left behind. The sound of ropes creaking against the stone was the only noise separating life from execution. For many of us, the basket represents that moment of deep humiliation where we lose control over our public image. It is the moment when depression or anxiety forces us to ask for help, to depend on the mercy of others. But understand this: the basket that humiliates you is often the very same basket that saves you. God was not just saving Paul's life, he was healing his soul from self-sufficiency. When Saul's feet touched the ground outside the walls, he was no longer an ordinary fugitive. He was a man who knew the fragility of life and the strength of divine protection in the midst of absolute helplessness. He ran to the desert, to the solitude of Arabia, where the silence of God would be his only teacher for 3 years. But the world still did not understand what this meant. The hunter now knew the smell of fear, but he also knew the taste of freedom that only the truth can give. The hunt was just warming up, and the deserts he would cross were only the preface to a resistance that would take him beyond his human limits. He was safe for now, but the shadows were moving. The next confrontation would not be against soldiers at gates, but against death itself under a rain of stones. And it is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine the weight of a choice that defies the very biology of fear. In Lystra, Saul, now known as Paul, experienced the height of human volatility. In one moment, the crowd worshipped him like a god, and calling him Hermes, wanting to offer sacrifices and crowns of flowers. In the next moment, incited by those who had hunted him since Damascus, that same crowd held stones in their hands. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the transition from applause to the impact of the first projectile. Stoning was not just a method of execution, it was a ritual of erasure. The goal was not just to kill the man, it was to destroy his form, break his bones, and silence his voice under a pile of rubble. It was not legend, it was not imagination, it was not exaggeration. The sound of a stone hitting a human body is something that, once heard, is never forgotten. It is a dry sound, a sound that signals the end of any physical resistance. Paul felt the first blow, then the second, then an unceasing rain of mineral hatred. The dust of Lystra mixed with the apostle's blood, and the world around him grew dark as he was dragged, like a dead animal, outside the city walls. For his attackers, the mission was accomplished. They left him there, a heap of flesh and torn garments, exposed to the sun and the scavengers. But the people still did not understand what this meant. Modern science tells us about trauma, about the collapse of the nervous system in the face of unbearable pain. But what happened outside the walls of Lystra defies the logic of conventional mental health. While the few remaining disciples wept over what they believed was his corpse, something supernatural began to pulse in those wounds. Read that again. Paul did not just regain consciousness, he stood up. Imagine being there. See the man, disfigured, his body covered in bruises that told the story of an unfinished execution, wiping the dust from his eyes and looking back at the city that had just tried to kill him. Most of us, after a trauma of this magnitude, would seek isolation, safety, the silence of grieving for our own health. But Paul's resilience was not based on the preservation of the self, but on the urgency of the message that lived within him. The decision he made next is what defines God's fugitive. He did not flee far away. He did not look for a cave to lick his wounds. He went back into the city, step by step, detail by detail. He walked back into the territory of trauma. This was not recklessness. It was the mind's absolute mastery over fear. Paul was demonstrating that when a man finds a purpose greater than his own life, physical pain becomes an irrelevant detail in the chronology of eternity. Emotional health, in this biblical perspective, is not the absence of scars, but the ability to carry those scars back to the battlefield without them paralyzing your march. He was teaching the new converts that the way to the kingdom of God passed through many tribulations, but that no stone was heavy enough to bury a divine promise. But that was not the end. And then, something even more serious happened. The persecution would not stop with stones. It would become more sophisticated. It would become cold, dark, and confined. The hunter was about to trade the open fields of Lystra for the iron chains of a Roman dungeon, where the silence of the walls would test his sanity in ways physical pain never could. This was where everything changed. Imagine absolute darkness, not the absence of light we experience in our bedrooms, but a thick, damp, suffocating darkness where the very air seems to weigh against your chest. In Philippi, Paul and Silas were not just imprisoned, they were thrown into the inner prison. Think about that for a moment. The inner prison was the heart of the dungeon, the place where oxygen was scarce and hope was a forgotten concept. Their feet were fastened in stocks, an instrument of torture that forced the legs into unnatural angles, causing excruciating cramps that shot up the spine to the brain. Hours earlier, they had been flogged. It was no light punishment. The Roman scourge tore through skin, exposing muscle and veins. Imagine being there, bleeding, in an environment infested with rats and waste, all with physical pain competing against the psychological weight of injustice. It is at this point that most of us would ask, where is the God who called me? Why did the light of Damascus bring me to this darkness? Anxiety and depression are often born from this sense of injustice and confinement. But Paul's resilience was not a denial of pain. It was a transmutation of pain, night after night, hour after hour. Around midnight, something impossible happened. The sepulchral silence of the prison was not broken by cries of agony, but by music. Imagine the sound of voices trembling yet firm, singing praises to God while the blood was still drying on their backs. It was not a song of superficial joy. It was a declaration of war against despair. The other prisoners listened. They did not understand. How can tortured men sing? How can someone whose feet are shackled have a free soul? This is the secret of biblical mental health. Your peace cannot be a prisoner of your circumstances. And then the cosmos answered. The earth began to roar. It was no ordinary tremor. It was a surgical earthquake. The foundations of the prison were shaken in such a way that the doors flew open and everyone's chains, understand this, everyone's, fell off. But the real danger was not the earthquake. It was the human reaction. The jailer, awakened by the chaos and seeing the doors open, drew his sword to kill himself. He knew that under Roman law, the escape of prisoners meant his own slow and shameful execution. He was about to become a statistic of despair. "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." Paul's voice pierced through the dust and panic. He did not flee when he had the chance. He remained to save the life of his captor. This is the pinnacle of emotional healing, when you stop being a victim of your wounds to become the healer of another's. Imagine the jailer's shock. He fell at Paul's feet, trembling. That night, that man's house, which was once a place of repression, became a place of feasting and baptism. Paul's wounds were washed by the hands that had once guarded him. But that was not the end. And then something even more serious happened. The freedom in Philippi was only a truce. God's fugitive still had a rendezvous with the sea itself, in a battle where nature would try to silence him once and for all. The hunt was now moving toward the heart of the empire, but the path would be paved with storms that would make the earthquake in Philippi seem like a whisper. There is a kind of silence that precedes disaster, a silence that makes us wonder if God has fallen asleep at the helm of our existence. Paul, now a prisoner on his way to Rome, found himself in the belly of an Alexandrian ship, facing the Euraquilo, a tempestuous and deadly wind that turned the Mediterranean into a throat of water and fury. Imagine the visual scene. The sky disappeared. For 14 days, neither sun nor stars were seen. Imagine total disorientation. No GPS, no compass, no light, only the sound of the ship's timbers groaning under the pressure of giant waves. The crew, men hardened by the sea, gave up the fight. They threw the cargo overboard. They threw the ship's gear. They threw away the very hope of being saved. It was not legend. It was not imagination. It was not exaggeration. 14 days without eating. Ye plunged into the cold fear that every wave would be the last. Think about that for a moment. How do you maintain sanity when everything around you is sinking? How do you be a leader when you yourself are a prisoner in chains? Paul's answer is the anchor for anyone facing an emotional storm today. He stood up in the middle of the rain-lashed deck and said, "Men, I urge you to keep up your courage." It was not toxic positivity. It was a confidence grounded in a voice he heard in the middle of the chaos. An angel of God had assured him, "Do not be afraid, Paul. God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." Here we reach the point of greatest tension. The ship was about to smash against rocks hidden in the darkness. The fear of death turned soldiers into executioners. You see, they planned to kill the prisoners so that no one would escape. Betrayal was at the door once again. If this journey of resilience and divine protection is speaking to your heart, do not let this message be lost in the storm. Consider subscribing and reflecting on how these truths can be the anchor for your own soul today. The ship struck. The impact was violent. The stern was being broken by the force of the waves. God's fugitive was now in the water, struggling against the surf, clinging to pieces of wood. All 276 passengers reached land, alive but exhausted on the island of Malta. But the desert and the sea were not the only enemies. While Paul was gathering sticks for a fire, even exhausted even after the shipwreck, he still served. A viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. The islanders looked and judged. This man is a murderer. Though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. Imagine the weight of that accusation. After surviving stones, floggings, prisons, and shipwrecks, luck seemed to have run out. Death was literally hanging from his arm. But Paul simply shook the snake into the fire and suffered no ill effects. Year after year, step by step, God's protection manifested not in the absence of serpents, but in immunity to their venom. But the journey had not yet reached its climax. Malta was just an island of rest before the final corridor. The fugitive was arriving at the heart of the beast, Rome awaited him, and with it, the final judgment that would transform his story of flight into an eternal legacy of victory. Imagine the sound of the silence that precedes the end. Not the silence of peace, but the icy silence of a stone tomb located below the street level of Rome. Paul, the man who crossed seas, survived shipwrecks, and faced angry crowds, now found himself in the Mamertine prison, the Tullianum. This was not the rented house where he received visitors at the start of his Roman stay. This was death row. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being there. The air is heavy with the smell of centuries-old dampness and despair. The Tullianum was a dark hole, accessible only through an opening in the ceiling through which prisoners were lowered. There were no windows. There was no light, only the constant dripping of water on the stone walls and the echo of his own thoughts. For any man's mental health, this scenario is the ultimate trigger for depression and emotional collapse. See, Paul was experiencing what many of us call the dark night of the soul. He wrote his final letter, the second to Timothy, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the vulnerability of a father who knows time is running out. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me. Read that again. Feel the weight of loneliness. Paul was not suffering only from the physical cold, for which he asked that his cloak be brought, but from the cold of abandonment. Demas, a companion in ministry, a friend who had seen miracles, left him alone in his greatest hour of need. The betrayal of a friend hurts more than the stones of Lystra or the floggings of Philippi. Year after year, step by step, Paul had invested his life in people, and now, in the darkness of Rome, he counted the few who remained. Only Luke is with me. But this is where the narrative of God's fugitive reaches its greatest spiritual depth. In the center of isolation, Paul did not become a victim of his circumstances. He did not allow the anxiety over Nero's judgment or the grief for lost friendships to consume his mind. He transformed the dungeon into a sanctuary of reflection. He knew the Roman system believed they were imprisoning a criminal, but Paul knew he was an ambassador in chains. The body was confined, but the word of God was not shackled. Think about the power of that statement. Often we feel like prisoners of toxic relationships, debts, or diseases, but real freedom begins in a mind grounded in eternal truth. The hunt that began in Damascus was coming to an end, but not as his pursuers imagined. They wanted his silence. But what they got was the eternalization of his voice. Every word written on those parchments, under the flickering light of an oil lamp in the prison, would echo for millennia, healing hearts and liberating minds long after the Roman Empire became nothing but dust and ruins. But the people still did not understand what this meant. The final confrontation would not be on a battlefield, but on an execution block. And it is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. The day of final judgment arrived. Imagine the contrast. On one side, Nero, the emperor who saw himself as a god, surrounded by purple, gold, and a madness that set cities on fire. On the other, an old apostle with calloused hands, a body marked by scars, and eyes fixed on something no one else could see. It was not legend. It was not imagination. It was not exaggeration. Paul stood before the greatest power on earth, but he did not tremble. He was not there to defend his life. He was there to testify to the life. At his first trial, he reported that no one came to his support, but that the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength. This is the ultimate lesson in resilience. The divine presence does not avoid the courtroom, but sustains us within it. The verdict was inevitable. As a Roman citizen, he would not be crucified like his master. but beheaded. The executioner led him outside the gates of Rome, along the Via Ostiense. Imagine the pace of that walk. Steady, intense, and progressive. Every step was an echo of all the miles he had traveled to announce the way. He passed through the city gates for the last time. The Roman sun shone upon him, the same sun that had blinded him in Damascus. But now, he needed no outside light. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. These are not the words of a captured fugitive. These are the words of an athlete crossing the finish line. They are the words of someone who mastered every trauma, overcame every depression, and defeated all anxiety through absolute surrender to a higher purpose. Imagine the moment he knelt, the flash of the blade, the silence. This was where everything changed. The instant Paul's head touched the Roman soil, the message he carried exploded into the world. The martyr's blood became the seed of a transformation no army could stop. The fugitive finally found what he was looking for. Not escape from death, but victory over it. The hunt ended. But Paul's legacy was only beginning. He proved that a man focused on God can be hunted but never caught, imprisoned but never enslaved, killed but never silenced. May this story of unbreakable resilience penetrate the deepest layers of your soul today. If you feel hunted by the shadows of the past or the anxieties of the present, remember the man who transformed a basket of humiliation into a vehicle of salvation and a dungeon of isolation into a portal to eternity. Close your eyes for a moment and feel the impact of this truth. Your journey does not end in the storm, nor in the shipwreck, nor in the prison. It ends in the glory of one who kept the faith until their final breath. We end this solemn account here with the weight of a truth that cannot be ignored. May Paul's example be the light that guides you through your own desert, until you too can say that you fought the good fight. If this epic narrative brought clarity to your walk and strength to your spirit, consider subscribing for more deep biblical reflections and leave a comment about which chapter of Paul's life resonated most with your own story today.